Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's begin. Today's story is called She Repaired His Childhood Home and Rebuilt His Faith Along the Way. Let's dive into this heartwarming journey of transformation and love. Mark Davis had never imagined his life would come to this. At 23, he was juggling law school, a part-time job, and an overwhelming amount of debt left behind by his late father. Every day felt like a struggle, with no end in sight. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. "Mr. Davis, this is Eleanor Brooks. I'd like to meet with you. It's regarding your financial situation." His frown deepened. "I'm sorry, who are you?" he asked, confused. She replied smoothly, "I know enough. Meet me at Brooks Bistro at 7 p.m. It's important." And with that, the call ended before he could ask any more questions. That evening, the rain poured down harder than ever as Mark made his way to the bistro. His jacket barely kept him dry as he stepped inside, the warmth of the restaurant contrasting sharply with the cold, damp streets. He was greeted by Eleanor Brooks, a striking woman with silver hair, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that exuded wealth and authority. "Mark," she said, her voice calm and commanding. "Please sit." Mark hesitated before sitting across from her. "Mrs. Brooks, what's this about?" he asked, still confused. She set down her teacup and locked eyes with him. "I know about your debts, the ones your father left behind. I know you're barely scraping by. I'm here to offer a solution," she said flatly. Mark stared at her, disbelief evident on his face. "What kind of solution?" he asked. "I'll pay off all your debts, ensure your financial security, but there's a catch," Eleanor continued, her gaze never wavering. "You'll marry me." Mark blinked, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "You want me to marry you?" he asked in shock. She nodded, her expression calm. "This isn't about love. It's a business arrangement. You'll marry me, and in return, I will take care of everything." Mark let out a laugh, not sure if he was being played. "Why me? You don't even know me?" he asked. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her eyes softening just a touch. "Exactly. You're young, unattached, and desperate enough to consider this offer. I don't need love, Mark. I need a companion. Someone to share my name, my estate." Mark shook his head in disbelief. "This is insane. I can't." But Eleanor held up her hand, silencing him. "Don't take too long to decide," she said coolly. "The offer won't last forever." Mark walked home that night, drenched by the relentless rain, his thoughts a whirlwind. The next morning, he sat at his kitchen table with his mother, explaining what had happened. She listened quietly, her face weary, but after a long pause, she spoke softly. "I know it sounds crazy, but if she's willing to help you, maybe it's worth considering." Mark stared at his hands, torn between his pride and the harsh reality of his situation. His mother's words echoed in his mind. "You have to save yourself." Later that day, Mark returned to the bistro. Eleanor was already waiting for him, her posture rigid and confident as always. "Have you made your decision?" she asked, not even looking up from the tablet in front of her. Mark took a deep breath and nodded. "I'll do it." Eleanor's lips twitched into a small smile. "Good. The arrangements will be made immediately." 1 week later, Mark stood in a small courthouse, dressed in the suit Eleanor had provided. The ceremony was simple, witnessed only by Eleanor's lawyer and a notary. As the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Mark couldn't help but feel uneasy. He had just made a life-changing decision for the sake of his family's survival, but deep down, he wondered if he had just sold his soul. As they left the courthouse, Eleanor turned to him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome to your new life, Mr. Davis." The weight of her words hung heavy in the air as they made their way to the grand estate that would now be his home. Mark looked around, feeling like an outsider in this world of luxury and power. He had agreed to this marriage for survival, but something about it gnawed at him. Was this really the life he wanted? But that was just the beginning. The next chapter of his life was about to unfold, and it would change everything he thought he knew about love, sacrifice, and what truly mattered. As the days passed, Mark found himself settling into the strange new life he had agreed to. He was now officially married to Eleanor, but the union felt like a business deal rather than anything resembling love. The mansion, with its cold marble floors and towering columns, seemed like a far cry from the cramped apartment he had grown up in. It was a world of luxury that felt both suffocating and unreal, a reminder of the price he had paid for security. Mark sat in his new office, a room overlooking the sprawling estate. The view was beautiful, but the weight of his decision weighed heavily on him. He had hoped to avoid this feeling, to push aside the guilt, but every time he looked around, he was reminded of how everything had changed. The debts were gone, his family was no longer struggling, but at what cost? Eleanor, on the other hand, seemed unfazed by the tension that hung between them. She moved through their new life with ease, attending high-profile meetings, hosting extravagant parties, and running her businesses with precision. Mark, however, was still trying to find his place. He spent his days going through the motions, trying to learn the ropes of a life he never imagined he would lead. It was in these moments of solitude that Mark began to notice something. Despite the distance between them, Eleanor's presence was different. She was always polite, always businesslike, but there were moments when she let her guard down. A quiet sigh after a long day, a brief smile when they shared a cup of coffee in the morning. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Mark to wonder if there was more to Eleanor than the calculated woman he had first met. One evening, as Mark walked through the vast hallways of the mansion, he stumbled upon a room he had yet to explore. It was tucked away behind a set of heavy oak doors, and as he stepped inside, he found himself in a small library. The shelves were lined with books, some old, some new, but what caught his eye was the photo on the desk. It was a picture of Eleanor, much younger, standing beside a man who was undoubtedly her father. Mark could feel the weight of the photo, the way it seemed to pull him into a moment of intimacy he hadn't expected. Curious, Mark picked it up, examining it more closely. The man in the photo looked like a stern businessman, but there was a softness in his eyes as he stood beside Eleanor, a connection that spoke volumes. It made Mark wonder about Eleanor's past, about the woman she had been before she became the powerful CEO he now knew. What had shaped her into the woman who had offered him a lifeline, and what had she lost along the way? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. Eleanor entered the room, her eyes briefly flicking to the photo in Mark's hand before she moved past him, heading toward the window. "I see you've discovered my father's old office," she said, her voice calm. But there was an undertone of something else. Something almost wistful. Mark placed the photo back on the desk and turned to face her. "Your father?" he asked, his curiosity piqued. Eleanor nodded, her gaze fixed on the view outside. "He was a complicated man," she said softly. "He built an empire, but he also lost a lot along the way. Family, happiness, love." She paused for a moment, and Mark could sense the weight of her words. "I was never close to him, not really. But I suppose, in the end, that's what drove me to be who I am now." Mark remained silent, watching her as she spoke. There was something vulnerable in her expression, something that hadn't been there before. For the first time, he saw a glimpse of the woman beneath the polished exterior. The woman who had offered him a deal, yes, but also someone who had clearly struggled with her own demons. As they stood in silence, Mark realized that this marriage, this arrangement, was not just about securing a future. It was about healing, about rediscovering parts of themselves they had both buried deep inside. He wasn't sure if they could ever truly love each other, but in that moment, Mark felt a sense of connection, an understanding that maybe they both needed each other more than they had initially thought. Later, that night, Mark lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. His thoughts were a tangled mess of emotions. He had come into this marriage with one goal, to save his family. But now, as he looked at Eleanor, as he began to understand her more, he wondered if there was a chance for something more, something real. It seemed impossible, but maybe, just maybe, they could build something together. A future where they weren't just two strangers living in the same house. And as he drifted off to sleep, Mark made a silent promise to himself. No matter what happened next, he would keep an open heart. Because sometimes, the most unexpected connections were the ones that changed everything. The days blurred together as Mark settled deeper into his new life. He continued his routine of attending meetings, pretending to be the husband of Eleanor Brooks, and living in the mansion that felt more like a gilded cage. Every day, He wrestled with the feeling of being an outsider in a world that seemed so far removed from his humble beginnings. But as time passed, Mark began to see small changes, subtle shifts that made him question everything he thought he knew about his marriage and about Eleanor. One chilly morning, Mark stood by the large windows of the mansion, staring out at the sprawling garden. The view was breathtaking, the flowers and trees carefully arranged, reflecting a sense of order and perfection. But just beneath the surface, something felt off. He couldn't shake the feeling that his life, though more comfortable, was becoming less and less his own. Eleanor entered the room, her steps light but purposeful, her demeanor as composed as ever. "Good morning," she said, her voice soft but carrying a hint of warmth. Mark turned to face her, offering a tight smile. "Good morning." They exchanged small pleasantries as Eleanor poured herself a cup of coffee, the steam rising gently from the mug. Mark watched her closely. Despite the calm exterior, he sensed there was more to her, something deeper. It was in the way her eyes sometimes lingered on old family photos, or the way her voice faltered when she mentioned her father. There was a story there, a hidden truth Mark was slowly starting to uncover. Later that day, as they sat together in the living room, Eleanor looked at Mark with a strange expression, as if weighing her words carefully. "Mark, I've been thinking," she said slowly. "I know you didn't sign up for this for us, but you're doing more than just playing a role. You're part of this family now, whether you realize it or not." Mark was taken aback by her words. He had never thought of himself as part of her family, especially not after all the tension and distance between them. "I'm just trying to help," he replied, his voice measured. "I never expected to be part of anything." Eleanor smiled faintly, her gaze softening. "I didn't expect this either," she admitted. "But sometimes life has a way of throwing us into situations we never saw coming. And we have to adapt. We have to make it work." For the first time in their marriage, Mark felt a flicker of something different. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was the start of something, an understanding, maybe, a realization that they were both in this together, for better or for worse. As the weeks passed, their interactions became more genuine. Eleanor would ask him about his day, and Mark found himself sharing more than he ever thought he would. They had started having small, quiet dinners together, where conversation flowed easily between them. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The walls that had once separated them began to crumble, bit by bit. One evening, Mark came home to find Eleanor sitting by the fireplace, her expression pensive. She didn't notice him at first, so he stood there for a moment, watching her. She looked so different from the powerful CEO he had first met. In this quiet moment, she seemed vulnerable. "Eleanor," he said softly, his voice breaking the silence. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with something Mark couldn't quite place. "I'm here," she replied, her voice calm, but with an edge of something he hadn't heard before. "Are you okay?" Mark asked, stepping closer. She didn't immediately answer, her gaze drifting to the flames in the hearth. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just tired. I've spent so many years building this empire. Sometimes I forget what it's all for." Mark didn't know how to respond. He had his own struggles, his own doubts, but hearing Eleanor's words made him realize just how much she had given up to achieve her success. It wasn't just the wealth or the power, it was the personal sacrifices she had made along the way. He sat down next to her, unsure of what to say, but he felt compelled to reach out in some way. "You've done a lot," he said quietly. "You've built something incredible, but you don't have to do it all alone." For a moment, Eleanor looked at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to understand the sincerity in his words. Then, just as quickly, she looked away, her walls going back up. "Thank you, Mark. But this is something I have to handle." Mark nodded, but deep down, he felt a shift between them. He wasn't sure where it would lead, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that something was starting to change. He had come into this marriage for financial stability, but now, as they shared these quiet moments together, he began to wonder if there could be more to their relationship than just a business arrangement. Later that night, Mark lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Eleanor's words echoed in his mind. He didn't know what the future held for them, but for the first time, he allowed himself to think that maybe, just maybe, this marriage could be something real. Maybe they could both find what they were looking for, even if they hadn't realized it yet. As he drifted off to sleep, Mark couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation for the days ahead. The journey they were on was just beginning, And though it seemed uncertain, Mark knew one thing for sure. It was a journey he wasn't ready to walk alone. The days turned into weeks, and Mark found himself becoming more immersed in this strange new life he had agreed to. The mansion, which had once felt like an impenetrable fortress, slowly began to feel more like a home. Eleanor was still the powerful CEO, the woman who commanded boardrooms and made decisions that impacted thousands. But lately, he had started to see a different side of her, the side that wasn't just about business, the side that was a little more human. They had started to talk more, share small moments together, and despite the complexity of their marriage, something subtle was changing. Mark began to feel a connection he hadn't expected, and for the first time, he wondered if this arrangement could turn into something real. One evening, as they sat together at dinner, Eleanor looked at him with a thoughtful expression. "Mark," she said, her voice soft but serious, "I know this whole situation has been complicated, and I want you to know that I'm not blind to what you've done for me." Mark glanced at her, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. He had spent so much time just going through the motions, trying to adjust to this new reality, that he hadn't realized Eleanor had been noticing his efforts. "I'm just doing what I agreed to," he replied, trying to keep his tone light. "It's part of the deal." But Eleanor shook her head slightly, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "It's more than that," she said softly. "You've been patient with me. You've stuck around even when things weren't easy. That means something, Mark." Mark didn't know what to say to that. He hadn't expected this kind of acknowledgement from her. Over the past few weeks, he had begun to notice things, the small gestures she made, the moments when she let her guard down. But he had also been careful not to get too attached. He still reminded himself that this marriage was a business arrangement, nothing more. However, Eleanor's words lingered in his mind. He had never expected her to see him like this. He had never expected that, in this strange, unexpected union, he might start to feel something more than just duty. But Eleanor had already been through so much. Her father's legacy, the empire she had built, the sacrifices she had made. Mark knew better than anyone how much it took to keep everything running smoothly, to keep pretending that everything was fine. That night, as Mark lay in bed, his thoughts kept returning to the conversation at dinner. Could this really be something more than just an arrangement? Could it be that, despite everything, there was a possibility for love between them? He wasn't sure, but as the days passed, he found himself hoping for it. The following week, Eleanor invited him to a charity gala, an event that she had been organizing for months. Mark wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew that attending the gala meant something. It meant they were publicly presenting themselves as a couple, no longer hiding behind the veil of a business arrangement. The night of the gala arrived, and Mark found himself standing beside Eleanor, dressed in a sleek black suit, feeling out of place in the sea of elegantly dressed guests. But as he looked at Eleanor, her poise and grace giving her an almost otherworldly presence, he felt a strange sense of pride. She was more than just a CEO. She was a woman with a mission, with a past, and now, maybe, with a future that involved him. As they made their way through the crowd, Eleanor introduced him to people, her usual confident self taking over as she navigated the event. Mark followed her lead, feeling a mix of awe and nervousness. He was starting to realize just how much this night meant for both of them. It wasn't just about business anymore. It was about proving to themselves, and to the world, that they had built something together. Later in the evening, as they stood on the balcony overlooking the city, Eleanor turned to him, her expression more relaxed than it had been all night. "Thank you for coming with me tonight," she said, her voice quiet. "I know this isn't easy for you, but I wanted you to know that I appreciate everything you've done. It's not just the marriage or the deal. It's you." Mark was taken aback by her words. He had never expected to hear something so personal, so vulnerable. He turned to her, his eyes meeting hers, and for a moment, the world seemed to slow down. In that moment, he saw Eleanor not as the CEO or the powerful woman he had first met, but as someone who had been just as broken, just as unsure as he was. "I never thought this would happen," Mark said, his voice softer than he intended. "But I've learned a lot from you. I've learned how to fight for something, how to believe in something bigger than myself." Eleanor smiled faintly, a hint of emotion in her eyes. "We've both come a long way, haven't we?" she said quietly. And as they stood there together, the city lights sparkling below them, Mark realized that whatever happened next, This was no longer just a marriage of convenience. It was something more, something that had the potential to change everything. As the night drew to a close, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting between them. They weren't just two people playing a role anymore. They were becoming something real. And for the first time, he felt truly hopeful about what the future held for them. The days following the gala were filled with an unexpected sense of ease. Mark found himself becoming more comfortable in his new life with Eleanor. The tension that had once hung between them was slowly dissipating, replaced by a quiet understanding that neither of them had expected. Eleanor continued to be the powerful, unflappable CEO, but now, when they were alone, she allowed herself moments of vulnerability that made Mark feel like he was truly getting to know her. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Eleanor invited Mark to join her for dinner at the mansion. It was a simple request, but for some reason, it made Mark feel more connected to her than he had before. As he walked into the dining room, he noticed the candlelight flickering softly on the table, casting a warm glow over the room. Eleanor was already seated, her usual composure in place, but there was something different in her eyes. She looked up as Mark entered, offering him a smile that felt more genuine than any he had seen before. "I thought we could have a quiet evening," she said. "No business, no distractions. Just dinner." Mark sat down across from her, and they shared a meal, the conversation flowing more easily than it ever had before. They talked about everything, about their pasts, their hopes for the future, and even the things that made them laugh. It was the first time they had truly spent time together without the weight of the contract between them. For the first time, Mark felt like he was seeing Eleanor for who she really was. As the evening wore on, Eleanor grew quieter. Her gaze seemed distant, as if she was lost in thought. Mark noticed the shift and asked, "What's on your mind?" Eleanor hesitated for a moment before answering, her voice softer than usual. "I've spent so much of my life focused on building this empire, on proving myself," she said. "But sometimes, I wonder if I've sacrificed too much. I wonder if I've missed out on something important." Mark listened closely, sensing the weight of her words. He could relate. He had spent so much of his life struggling to get by, just trying to keep his head above water. But now, with Eleanor, he was beginning to understand that there was more to life than just surviving. "I think," Mark said slowly, "sometimes we get so caught up in what we're trying to achieve that we forget what truly matters. Maybe it's not just about what we build, but who we build it with." Eleanor looked at him, her expression softening. "I used to believe that all of this, the business, the money, it was everything," she said, her voice tinged with a hint of regret. "But now I'm not so sure." The vulnerability in her voice was something Mark hadn't expected. It made him realize that despite her strength and success, Eleanor, too, had doubts, just like anyone else. In that moment, Mark felt a shift within himself. He wasn't just here because of the contract. He was here because he had started to care about her. Maybe not in the way he thought he would, but in a way that was real. After dinner, they moved to the living room, sitting together on the couch. The conversation shifted to lighter topics, but the unspoken bond between them remained. Mark couldn't help but feel a sense of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. For the first time, he felt like they were two people who had found something meaningful in each other. As they sat there, a silence settled between them, but it was comfortable, the kind of silence that spoke volumes. Eleanor leaned her head back against the couch, her eyes closing for a moment, as if she were savoring the peace of the moment. Mark, still processing everything that had been said, sat quietly next to her. It was then that Eleanor spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for being here, for sticking around." Mark turned to her, his heart racing for reasons he couldn't quite explain. He had come into this marriage with the belief that it was just a contract, just a way to survive. But now, as he sat beside Eleanor, he realized that it had become so much more. They had both changed, in ways that were unexpected but real. Eleanor opened her eyes and looked at him, her gaze soft. "I don't know what comes next, Mark," she said, "but for the first time in a long time, I'm starting to feel like maybe it could be something worth having." Mark smiled, his heart swelling with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't ready to let go of this new connection, this new chance. And for the first time, he didn't feel like he was just playing a role. He felt like he was finally living a story that was his own. As the evening came to a close, Mark couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. He had come into this marriage to fix his problems, to find a way out of his struggles. But now, as he looked at Eleanor, he realized that maybe the solution wasn't about fixing anything at all. Maybe it was about finding something new, something unexpected, and letting it grow. And as they said goodnight, Mark's mind buzzed with possibilities. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid of it. Whatever came next, he knew he would face it with Eleanor by his side. As the days passed, Mark found himself more and more absorbed in the world he had never imagined he would be a part of. Eleanor was still the powerful CEO, but the distance between them had begun to shrink. Their interactions, once filled with formality and obligation, now held moments of true connection. Eleanor had allowed him to see a side of her that was rarely shown to the world, the vulnerable, human side. And Mark, despite his initial reservations, had begun to let his guard down as well. One evening, after a long day at work, Mark arrived at the mansion to find Eleanor sitting by the fireplace, her expression thoughtful. She was still in her business attire, but there was something different about her tonight. The usual air of confidence had softened, replaced by something that looked like exhaustion. "Mark," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "Can we talk?" Mark hesitated for a moment, sensing the seriousness in her tone. He nodded, walking over to join her by the fire. "Of course," he said, sitting down next to her. For a moment, they both sat in silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire. Eleanor stared into the flames, her hands clasped together in her lap. Mark didn't know what to say, but he could feel the weight of whatever was on her mind. Finally, Eleanor spoke, her voice low but steady. "I've been thinking about everything, about us. I know this whole arrangement was supposed to be a business deal, but the more time I spend with you, the more I realize how much I've been holding back. I don't know if you feel the same, but I'm starting to think that maybe this could be something more." Mark's heart skipped a beat at her words. He had been feeling the same way, but hearing her say it out loud made everything feel more real. "Eleanor, he began, but she held up a hand, silencing him. "I know this hasn't been easy for you," she said, her voice softening. "But I want you to know that I appreciate everything you've done for me. I don't think I ever truly let anyone get close to me until now. And I don't know what the future holds, but I want to find out with you." Mark was taken aback by her openness. He had never expected Eleanor to open up like this. She had always seemed so strong, so self-contained, and yet here she was, admitting her own fears and doubts. It was a side of her that Mark hadn't seen before, and it made him realize just how much he had come to care for her. "I never expected to be in this position," Mark said, his voice sincere. "When we first got married, I thought it was just a way to fix my problems. But now, I don't know. It feels like I found something I never even knew I was looking for." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "Are you saying you feel the same?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark didn't hesitate. He nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "I do," he said simply. "I've never felt more connected to anyone in my life. And I think that maybe, just maybe, we have a chance at something real." Eleanor smiled, the weight on her shoulders seemingly lifting. For the first time in a long while, she looked at peace. "Maybe we do," she said softly. The evening continued with more conversation, but it was different now. There was no longer any pretense, no more acting. They were simply two people, finding their way together, each realizing that the other was no longer just a part of a contract, but someone who could be trusted, someone worth fighting for. As the night drew to a close, Eleanor turned to Mark, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "Whatever happens next," she said, "I'm glad we've come this far." Mark reached for her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "Me too," he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Me too." The night was quiet as they sat together by the fire, the future uncertain, but for the first time, they weren't afraid of it. They were ready to face whatever came next, together. Weeks passed, and with each day, the bond between Mark and Eleanor grew stronger. The mansion, which had once felt like a prison to Mark, now seemed like a place of possibility. Eleanor, too, had started to change in ways Mark hadn't expected. The confident CEO who once ran everything with an iron fist now had moments of softness, moments when she let her guard down. They had built something together, something neither of them had anticipated. But with that growing connection came new challenges, and one evening, those challenges came to a head. It started with a phone call. Eleanor had been on a conference call all afternoon, her voice sharp and precise as she handled business. But when the call ended, something in her demeanor shifted. Mark noticed it immediately. There was a look of frustration on her face, a rare crack in the usually unshakable exterior. "Everything okay?" Mark asked as he entered the room, trying to gauge her mood. She looked up, her face tight with tension. "It's fine," she said, but the way she avoided his eyes told him otherwise. "You sure?" Mark pressed, stepping closer. Eleanor sighed, setting the phone down with a soft thud. "It's just business stuff," she said, brushing it off. But Mark knew there was more to it. "What happened?" he asked gently. For a moment, Eleanor hesitated, as if deciding whether or not to share what was on her mind. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter now. "I've been dealing with some financial issues with the company. Some of the investors want to pull out, and I can't let that happen. This empire I've built, it's everything to me. If I lose it, I don't know what I'll have left." Mark stood there, listening intently. He had always known how much the business meant to her, but hearing the vulnerability in her voice made him realize just how much pressure she was under. He stepped closer, his hand resting on her shoulder. "You're not alone in this, Eleanor. We're in this together." Eleanor's eyes softened, but she shook her head. "I've always done things on my own," she said. "I don't know how to let anyone in." Mark looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "You don't have to do this alone," he said firmly. "We've built something here. This marriage, it's real. And so is everything we're doing." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. For the first time, Eleanor looked at him not as a business partner or a convenient husband, but as someone who genuinely cared. She had always been the one to control everything, but in that moment, Mark was offering her something she had never allowed herself before, a chance to share the burden. "I don't know how to trust anyone," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "But I'm starting to think I might be able to trust you." Mark smiled softly, his heart swelling with a mixture of emotions. "You can trust me," he said, his voice low and reassuring. "I'm here for you, no matter what happens." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and fear. For the first time, she allowed herself to truly let go of the walls she had built around herself. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice cracking. "I'm scared, Mark. I don't know if I can do this." Mark took her hand in his, squeezing it gently. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," he said. "You don't have to do everything alone. I'm here with you. We'll figure it out together." As they stood there, holding each other, Mark realized how far they had come. When they first met, everything had been about survival, about keeping up appearances. But now, it was about something more. It was about trust, partnership, and building a life together, even when the future seemed uncertain. And as Eleanor rested her head against his chest, Mark knew one thing for sure. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. No longer just a marriage of convenience. This was something real, something worth fighting for. Days turned into weeks, and the bond between Mark and Eleanor grew stronger. The weight of their past struggles seemed lighter as they began to find their rhythm together. The tension that had once defined their relationship, a result of their initial arrangement, was now replaced by something deeper, something real. They weren't just pretending anymore. They were partners, navigating the challenges of life side by side. The business issues Eleanor had been dealing with still loomed large, but with Mark by her side, she began to face them with renewed strength. No longer was she alone in her battles. Mark had proven, time and again, that he was more than just a husband in name. He was her rock, her support, the one person who made her feel like she could breathe again. One evening, after another tense meeting with the investors, Eleanor came home later than usual. Mark was waiting for her in the living room, a glass of wine in hand, the room lit softly by the glow of the fireplace. She looked exhausted, her eyes tired, but when she saw him, a small, tired smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "Tough day?" Mark asked, standing up to greet her. Eleanor sighed, setting her bag down by the door. "You could say that," she replied, her voice tinged with frustration. "But I think we've made some progress. I'm hopeful. I think we'll get through this." Mark walked over to her, gently taking her hand in his. "You've been handling everything with so much strength. I'm proud of you," he said, his voice sincere. Eleanor looked at him, her heart swelling at his words. It wasn't often that she allowed herself to acknowledge the weight of her achievements, but in this moment, with Mark standing beside her, she felt seen. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice soft. "I don't think I could do it without you." Mark smiled, his thumb brushing over the back of her hand. "You're not alone in this, Eleanor. You never were." As the night wore on, they spent time together in comfortable silence. The air between them was no longer heavy with unspoken tension. Now, there was an easy quiet that filled the room, a quiet that spoke volumes about how far they had come. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about living, about sharing the burden, about making a life together. The next day, Eleanor had another big meeting with the investors, and Mark was by her side, as always. This time, however, she felt a sense of confidence she hadn't had before. She had Mark's unwavering support, and that made all the difference. When the meeting ended, Eleanor stepped out of the conference room with a sense of relief. The deal wasn't finalized, but it was a step in the right direction. She turned to Mark, her face lighting up with a genuine smile. "We did it," she said, the words full of meaning. Mark grinned, his eyes sparkling with pride. "We did," he said, pulling her into a brief embrace. As they left the building together, Eleanor's hand in his, Mark couldn't help but reflect on everything that had brought them to this point. What had started as a business arrangement had evolved into something neither of them had expected. They had come together out of necessity, but now, they were something more. They were a team. That night, as they sat in the quiet of their home, Eleanor looked at Mark, her eyes soft. "You've changed everything for me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Mark reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I've changed too," he said quietly. "And it's all because of you." They sat together, the weight of the world no longer pressing down on them. There were still challenges to face, still uncertainties ahead, but for the first time, neither of them felt afraid. Whatever came next, they would face it together, as partners. And in that moment, that was enough. Weeks passed, and with each passing day, Mark and Eleanor's relationship continued to evolve. What had once been a marriage born out of necessity had transformed into something genuine. They were no longer two strangers bound by a contract. They were partners, partners in life, in love, and in the challenges that came with it. Eleanor's business had stabilized, and the pressures of her career were no longer as overwhelming. It was a huge relief, but more than that, she felt at peace knowing she had someone to share it with. One afternoon, Eleanor called Mark into her office. She had just finished an important meeting and, as always, was focused on the task at hand. But today, there was a different look in her eyes, one of contentment, even joy. "I've been thinking," Eleanor began, her voice calm and steady, as she looked up from her desk at Mark. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Mark nodded, stepping closer to her. "Yeah, we have. And I can't imagine doing it without you." Eleanor smiled softly, her eyes reflecting a sense of relief and hope she hadn't known in years. "I don't know what I was expecting when this all started," she said. "But it's turned out to be more than I could have ever imagined. I never thought I would find someone who would understand me the way you do." Mark reached out, taking her hand in his thumb brushing over her knuckles in a reassuring gesture. "I didn't expect to find someone like you either," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I didn't expect any of this, Eleanor. But I'm glad I did. You've changed everything for me, too." Eleanor looked down at their intertwined hands, then back up at Mark, her gaze filled with quiet appreciation. "I'm glad you're here," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what the future holds, but I know I want to face it with you." Mark's heart swelled at her words, and for a moment, he couldn't say anything. The truth was, he had never felt more certain of anything in his life. He had entered this marriage unsure of everything, just hoping for a way out of his struggles. But now, as he stood here with Eleanor, he realized how far he had come, how much he had gained. Not just a secure future, but a partner who truly cared about him. "Whatever happens next," Mark said, his voice steady, "I know we'll face it together. I'm not going anywhere." Eleanor's smile deepened, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to fully relax. She had spent so many years building walls around herself, trying to protect her heart from getting hurt. But now, with Mark beside her, she realized that those walls were no longer necessary. She had found someone who wouldn't let her down. A few days later, they attended another gala together, this time not as a business arrangement, but as a couple who had truly built something real. As they entered the ballroom, their hands intertwined, they were greeted by friends and colleagues. They weren't just the business partners everyone thought they were partners in life. And that was more than enough. Later that evening, as they stepped out into the cool night air, Eleanor stopped and turned to Mark. "I don't think I ever would have believed this could be real," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "But here we are, Mark. We've made it." Mark smiled, his heart full of gratitude. "Yeah," he said softly. "We have." And as they stood there, looking out at the city skyline, they both knew that no matter what came next, they were ready to face it together. They had found something neither of them had expected, a love built not on convenience, but on trust, understanding, and a shared future. And for the first time, they both believed that it was enough. The journey they had started together had led them to a place they never thought possible, and they were both finally ready to embrace the future, together,